Hey y'all, how's it going? We're here, we're live. My hands are so very dry. How are your hands doing? I actually had to buy moisturizer the other day, hand cream, and I don't like the feeling, but here I am and I'm rubbing hand cream on my hands like a crazy person. It doesn't fill me with joy, it does not spark joy, as Marie Kondo would say. Hi, John James. I am here. They barely let me on campus today. It was most exciting. They said I have to sign in as I've been doing for like the past week and a half. And today, of all days, security guard said, "Oh, and what department are you in?" I said, "I'm in folklore." And I said, "Well, you're not on the list." And I said, "Oh, there's a list. You actually published a list." And they said, "Oh, yes, it's been sent down from the administration last week." And I said, "Oh, but without actually telling anybody." So, yeah, we haven't been enforcing it. It's like, this is not the day. This is not the day, good sir. So I sneezed in his face. Anyway, I hope you're all good. Chloe is finally having a chance to move her dorm room stuff from her car to her home. Gosh, small baby steps. It's summer. It's officially summer as of tomorrow. Oh my goodness. Just think of all the social distance clam bakes and the social distance mountain climbing and the social distance street parades and all the fun. You should just look up Rise Up by the Parachute Club and see exactly how your summer should be spent, and then realize that's likely not the case. Anyway, we got a lot to cover today. I am upset. I have a lot. The notes are up. The PDF has been there since last night, and I'm not going to try and race through. But I don't want to dawdle a huge amount. Kima feels like we straight up skipped spring. Hello, all. Yeah, I'm lying about it being summer. I'm looking out my office window, and there's still snowdrifts everywhere. It's cold. Kima, you're still in town, right? So it's cold here still. There is nothing happening. But yes, our March was not fun. So just quickly, some notes on the final, because I want to cover that. I'm going to sort of be doing a synopsis at the end, but just to sort of get some points out of the way. It's still going to be on the 16th. I keep on calling it a Friday, but it's actually a Thursday. I'm opening up the window of when to write it just a little bit. I'm having it from noon until 7. So if you write within that period, that's all it's going to be required. So take 3 hours. You're still capped. You don't have 7 hours to write it. You have 7 hour window within which to find the 3 hours to write it. So you probably shouldn't start much after 4 Atlantic time. But that's because there are people who are now in different time zones, and there might be childcare issues or something that's sort of throwing you for a loop. So I just thought I'd open it up a little bit. Otherwise, the structure is still that hasn't changed. It's still going to be some multiple choice questions, some sentence long short answer questions. The proportion from the midterm to the final might shift because like some are worth 1 point and some are worth 2 point. So I will sort of combine them so that they total 15, and then an essay question. You have a choice of 2 questions for the essay. The emphasis is going to be on the second half of the semester, with only a little bit sneaking around from the first. A cheat sheet has yet to be prepared, but it will be by Monday. That's probably going to be like basically the next thing on my working agenda is to get the cheat sheet out for this course and then start grading assignments for the rest of my life. So that's where that's heading. Again, you can bring the cheat sheet with you. It's going to be strange because you're going to be sitting at a computer, but there you go. We only have your conscience to be your guide. There's no draconian virtual proctoring that's possible. So I just presume. But also the questions, I mean, certainly like the essay question, it isn't really something that you can cheat on because it's about synthesis. You have to kind of know what you were talking about. And then the short answers are maybe. I don't know. I'm also going to take all the notes. Someone said that the slides were useful, but since I save them as PDFs, they are not necessarily great for like cutting and pasting into study documents. And someone said, could you put the PowerPoints up? But then you could take the PowerPoints and you can change them. And for some reason, that sort of starts to make me a little bit squishy. It's like I don't have the syllabus in a Word file. I have it in a PDF so that it's not malleable. That's just my thing. But what I am going to do is I'm going to extract all the text on them and turn them into like one massive Word document. So you'll have something that's much more easy to cut and paste from. I think certainly with the PowerPoints as PDFs, there's like a formatting issue that's just doubly complicated. Yeah, so it might not be pretty. It's just going to be this page upon page of PowerPoint will be saved as sort of note form points and indents and so on. But that's what you get. I will not leave it in desperate states, but I'm not going to spend the 3 hours it takes to necessarily sort of proofread it into a piece of perfection. The slides are there. The slides are fine. Hi, Annabelle. Hi, Brian. Yay, we go. All right. That's the button I shouldn't have hit, but that's okay. So, Kiss of Death. What did you think? Hi, Shiandra. What did you think of this particular reading?
He's going to pause. Allow chat windows to go through. He's going to stare at the camera. With his baby blue eyes, his only good feature, although they're also not necessarily pointing in the same direction or symmetrically placed upon his face. But if you look at just one eye individually, it's an attractive eye. Even I say that, and I have terrible self-esteem issues. I'm presuming you're all writing paragraph upon paragraph, just marshalling your thoughts. You can hit send halfway through. I'll be able to follow. Quite.
What I liked about this chapter is it sort of sneaks up on you because first of all, it's like some nice old school folklore in a way, and then it's like here we have this theme, and here we have this theme that's emerging. What is it about? What is it about the kiss? What is it about kisses of death that seems so prominent? And can we come up with some kind of taxonomy? So this is, as I said, in many ways, it's kind of old school folklore put into new ways, which is my personal way of doing it. I like sort of, like my stuff with stand up. I sort of tend to go back to like the stuff of the 40s and 50s and 60s and like really try and model it on that way, knowing that I'm not talking about traditional texts. And because I don't know, for some reason, I like this blend of the traditional and the modern scholarship. And I think Andrea is basically doing something similar here. Hi, Evie, which I only now realized how to pronounce. Thank you. Alkema said, I want to look into Legends of Poison's makeup now after that chapter. Yeah, exactly. That theme was kind of neat. But I mean, it's one of the things to think about. What are we talking about when we're talking about a kiss? Obviously, we know the action. And we also know the action that sometimes we are saying kissing, but we really mean a deeper form of canoodling. And that's fine. But, it is an action that is typically based on trust, mutual affection. It's limited to people that you have a particular level of intimacy with, not necessarily sexual intimacy, but your closed circle. Obviously, paramours, familial, father, parent and child, cousins, and you might be in one of those families where like, oh, I'm kissing my grandma on the lips. That's a bit peculiar, but again, sort of culturally ordained, but still there are people that you kiss and there are people that you don't kiss. And it's similar in many ways to like what Mary Douglas talks about. Do I have the, I think I have it later on in a slide. Mary Douglas talks about the meal. And the meal is something that there's sort of different levels of food. There are people that you don't eat with because they're basically strangers. And then there are people that you have some kind of connection to, but you don't really feast with them. You might you might exchange something. So coffees, for example, if you go to meetings and there's like coffees and sandwiches and so on, that's kind of a different kind, a different level of food sharing, food event, than like the large family supper, which is something that you bring in together. You think about like sort of the Old Testament prescriptions about who you are meant who you're meant to break bread with. Breaking bread with someone becomes a metaphor for a certain kind of intimacy and a certain kind of trust relationship. Kisses work the same way. There's only certain people that you kiss, and those people tend to be inside the house, if you can see where this is going. And what happens when the kiss becomes dangerous? So, so it's clearly... So you have this thing, this kiss, this almost universal action, I am presuming, again with variations on how conservative or liberal you are with how broad a circle of people that you might actually kiss. But we also have this ridiculously long list of traditional like 19th century narratives, like what the old school folklorists would call sort of traditional narratives that have to do with dangerous kisses, and what happens when you bring that in to the contemporary. Cool. Hello, I'm here. Chandra said she read the book. Awesome. Where am I going? Next slide. So yeah, the question is, who kisses? And I like that she sort of frames this notion of that the kiss is framed, at least in narrative, as like the kisser and the kissed. I'm presuming, and I'm hoping, that in most of your mutual relationships there might be an initiator, but for the most part it is a balanced act for those of you who kiss. But in the narrative, there is always like an active and a passive agent. And of course, the passive agent is fundamentally the person who is going to be victim. And the active agent is the one who's going to be, whether knowingly or unknowingly, aggressor in these dangerous kisses. So already you're sort of reconfiguring the kiss as a meeting of disparates, as opposed to potentially what the kiss ought to be, the meeting of on sort of mutual levels. And then she has these distinctions: kisses from a stranger, so the person who is far outside of that level of people that you might be on any given moment expected to kiss. The intimates, people who you would on a regular basis be kissing. It is not an unusual occurrence. And then the intimate other, the intimate stranger. I just stick to intimate stranger for the notes, but she frames it that way. This person who is again, let's just throw out our big words there, liminal. They're in this neither nor position. They are stuck in between. They're not stranger, but they're not the people that you would normally be kissing. They're on this sort of periphery. Again, to use the metaphor of Douglas and the meal, that's where I put it. It's kind of, these are the people that you might go for, you might have coffee with, but you wouldn't necessarily have a meal with. The different level of intimacy is not for them. But then it's sort of this transgressive. So people, really fundamentally, it's people that you oughtn't to be kissing, because it's a form of interaction that is not that bursts forward or bursts through the typical limitations on the interactions that you would have with those people. And then she sets up this interesting taxonomy, the details of which we can sort of skip through because it's the bulk of her chapter is on this. But I think it's a really interesting thing to work through. So you have the stranger, the intimate stranger, and the intimate as the three fundamental categories of people. Then you have the intent to harm and the intent not to do harm. And so I laid it out on the slide. It's slide 5. Might be a little bit teeny tiny on that page. Excuse me. but hopefully it's still legible. So a stranger who doesn't intend harm doesn't kiss you. That's sort of like, that would be the blocked out part of this particular chart. But then the stranger who does intend harm, it is sometimes like it's because it seals a pact with an ultimate other, like an angel or a demon, and it usually indicates some kind of benefit that you would get, and then you'd have death. Or it has this this interesting theme, which is now Kima's new obsession, which is the poisoned makeup, the sort of temptress assassin who uses makeup to apply some actual kiss of death. So yeah, those are the kind of kisses that would come from a stranger. But again, the whole section is reasonably brief. It isn't. There aren't that many stories out there, because the unlikelihood of being in a situation where you would be kissing a stranger is negligible. So perhaps on a narrative level, it's fine, but it's also like, it's not an action. I mean, the strangers are already doing terrible things to you. Kissing is likely not one of them. It's too big of a transgression. Intimate stranger seems to be one of the more prominent ones. I mean, of the three, it's in some ways fairly central. Getting Game of Thrones vibes from the poisoned makeup. Yeah, Andrea actually mentions that directly in there, doesn't she? There's a character who does that. I'm pretty sure there's awesome movie at one point, or maybe it was like a Get Smart or something. Anyway, blanking on that. So the intimate stranger who intends no harm. It's typically someone that you oughtn't to be kissing, but you kiss anyway, or kiss you anyway. So that has to do. There's a lot of stories about like the accidental incest, and the reason that these are kisses of death is that so often you have narratives where people virtually die in some way or another. They either are driven insane, which sort of becomes a kind of a one form of death, that their lives are effectively over by being irrevocably damaged, or they're driven to suicide or whatever. That's often a tag. So at the very least, they still fall under this rubric, even if the death isn't necessarily literal. There was definitely poisoned makeup in Get Smart. That's what the chapter reminded me of. Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to make eye contact with Charlotte by taking my eyes off of the camera. Thank you, Charlotte. I was right. Well, which Get Smart though? Was it the original Don Adams one, or was it the Steve Carell movie? It's fine if it's the Steve Carell movie. I just need that point of clarification. So the accidental incest, and then the other forms. Again, these are kisses that don't intend harm, and there's the accidental STD. Where unknowingly you become infected through a tryst that is still transgressive. It is something that you oughtn't to be doing, but it is not it was not done with ill intent. The kiss itself was consensual. The kiss itself was not expected to pass along any kind of act. And the accidental incest or the near miss of the accidental incest is also that. It's two people who consensually get together and only subsequently, or perhaps only just in time, realize the consequences of it. Charlotte, the original ones, thank you. And then you have the kiss that is meant to do harm, or you have the incubus or the succubus, which, again, this is where my gray area is, since I, for the most part, have no real background in the supernatural. I'm trying to remember what the difference between the incubus and the succubus is. But I kind of have the feeling that some of the people who are keen and actually on April 3rd watching this video at this moment could probably provide the definition of both an incubus and a succubus. At the very least, one of y'all could Google it while I'm here. But creatures that are that use physical contact, eros, in order to absorb power. Chloe, does this have any background on how the mafia boss may kiss one of the crime family to signify they'll be killed for their betrayal? Oh, read ahead. Yes, but we haven't got there yet. Looking at you. So you have the supernatural incubus and succubus, and then you have sort of presumably like the metaphorical, again, that issue of the temptress or the seductress that becomes metaphorically an incubus or a succubus. And probably only one of those, because I'm not 100% sure about the distinction. Maybe one's male, one's female, not really sure. Then there's the accidental incest, but through non-consensual sex. And basically, in all those really gross narratives that Watley and Henkin talks about, and Andrea summarizes in terms of sexual assaults at frat parties where the sister happens to be one of the people. So the intent is not incest is not the intent, but certainly violence was the intent. Assault was the intent. So it's reframed that way. It's not this. Yeah, I mean, I don't need to explain the concept of consent. Harm was meant, even if it wasn't the specific harm, even if it wasn't harm to that specific individual. It was to the. It would sort of still falls into that category. Similarly, you have, it's opposed to the accidental STD transmission that you have in that sort of earlier character of intimate stranger who intends no harm, you have the deliberate infector narratives. You have the AIDS Marys and so forth, or Welcome to the World of AIDS, or AIDS Harry. So you have someone who knowingly is spreading the disease. You, because we're always talking about that we, as we said on the last slide or the slide before, that we always tend to associate ourselves with the kissed as opposed to the kisser. The narrative places us in the position of the kissed. That you enter into a relationship unwittingly. Well, sorry, not unwittingly. That implies coercion. That perhaps knowing it is transgressive, like the standard "Welcome to the World of AIDS" or AIDS Mary narrative is someone. Goes to a businessman is on a business trip and meets someone at the hotel bar and who invites him up to her room, and so he follows and so they have some kind of tryst, and then Welcome to the World of AIDS. And not simply does it sort of talk about sort of the whole feminine temptress narrative, it also sometimes used as an explanatory device on how AIDS enters into a community that wouldn't necessarily have it. So it's through transgressive acts, but it was present a lot in Newfoundland, trying to explain how the initial infections of AIDS and HIV might have entered into Newfoundland, which sees itself as archly conservative. It's like, oh, well, a person engaged in risk behavior on the mainland and then brought it here. So there's that. And then over and above the accidental, so the intentional STD infection, you have the abnormal STD infection, where you might have entered into it in a deliberate, with the same kind of deliberation as the accidental one. Like, oh, I met this guy, it was fine, but then you develop a disease, and it turns out to be a disease that is particular to people who are cannibals. And so, it is not necessarily that the act was intended with harm, but this is clearly a bad actor. This is not someone who operates within the realms of society and is accidentally infected themselves. No. This is a monstrous human being that you have accidentally momentarily fallen for. Succubus, female demon, sex with men. Incubus, male demon, sex with women. Thank you, Kima. There we go. Evie, have to leave early, unfortunately. I'm going to get my laptop prepared earlier than planned. Bye, Evie. Yes. Hooray. Well, that solved that problem that you and I had. We'll talk later. And then finally, you have the third category, kisses involving intimates, people that you you should, by all narrative rights, be kissing. That's perfectly fine, whether it's romantic, whether it's familial, but kisses happen, and it's all very well and good. There's nothing transgressive about the act, and yet, lo and behold, something happens, and a kiss of death occurs. There's the metaphor of Rogue from X-Men. And someone who It's like almost like, I guess, maybe an accidental succubus. Clearly, not in a sort of demonic way. Maybe Bo from Lost Girl would sort of fall under that as well. So one is kissed by them, and despite all desire to have a normal relationship with a supernatural creature, lo and behold, you cannot. But you also have the accidental STD transmission from parent to child. That's probably, that's either things like, not knowing that one had it, or hiding that one had it, the sort of the vague aspects, and then transmitting it either through at birth, or a sort of a second part to the accidental STD transmission of the intimate stranger, where you get the kiss from someone, and then you pass it on to your wife or to your child accidentally, and that, again, there's no specific or harm intended. One of the versions that Andrea has is even, it's just like, it's not a even the original kiss isn't necessarily that transgressive an act. It's just like, I went to a party and the hostess, was one of those people who kisses. Like, okay. And then later on, you see she has a cold sore. Then, oh boy, this ain't going to go well. And lo and behold, it transmits. But it's not even the transgression of something that is, about infidelity. It's about, this is a person whose mores are such that her circle of who you kiss is wider than the circle that I am in. But when in Rome, kiss, well, there you go. So there's already that kind of that intimate stranger thrown in there. And then there's the final category of where it's not really the result of the kiss itself in terms of a kind of infection or contagion. Rather, it's what during the act of kissing, something terrible happens. Often a weapon falls from a holster, discharges, and shoots a child. So in the most tender and loving act, the most tragic circumstance arises. And again, a reasonably common theme about the seeming safety of the kiss, and what the seeming safety of the kiss ought to represent, and then the danger that might be present in it. And then finally, here's that thing that Chloe was asking about in terms of the kiss of death, which is the between intimates, where you mean harm. So that whether it's in the Godfather, whether it's in then parodied in The Simpsons and so on, where that idea that yes, you indicate basically you recognize that someone has betrayed you and that they are going to be punishing by giving them a kiss. It is the other example, of course, is Judas, where you are symbolizing the act of betrayal. Someone is betrayed with a kiss. Again, those stories are few. The intimate who intends harm is probably as almost, but not quite as rare as the stranger who doesn't intend harm. But the stranger doesn't intend harm, isn't kissing you, and the intimate who does intend harm is a rarity, a true sort of violation, and so on. And then Andrew talks about the peanut butter kiss, which was interesting because I remember when this happened, because it happened in October or September of 2005, and it was just when I was starting here. And it was just in the early days of social media. Like literally, Facebook was not yet available to people who weren't registered students at American universities, because Facebook was originally sort of a closed network. Twitter was yet to be a thing, and so I can't even remember the context in which I came across it, but it was certainly through the internet. But yeah, the story of Christina Desforges in Saguenay, who was at a party, had an anaphylactic shock, died, and it was reported that it was a consequence of her having been kissing her boyfriend, who hours previous had eaten a peanut butter sandwich, and there were still traces about, and which were enough to affect her her allergies. The coroner's report later dismissed that and talked about the just referring back because I wrote the word down, but it's all Latin. Cerebral anoxia, so lack of oxygen to the brain as a consequence of a severe asthma attack, does not necessarily suggest what the cause of the severity of the asthma attack is, apart from potentially both cannabis and sexual activity, although there's no account on how sexual activity was had even occurred. So a lot of ambiguity, but in large part doesn't, like we see. The cool thing, it's not a cool thing because someone died, but the fascinating thing for folklorists is you sort of we're able to see in real time the emergence of a legend-like thing. And again, we've said from the beginning that just because something happened doesn't mean it doesn't qualify as a contemporary legend. Contemporary legends aren't falsehoods. They're not myths. They are the narrative explanation of events. And so on occasion, not all the time, sometimes they're fabrications, but on occasion they are retellings, representative and shaped retellings of an actual historical moment that is that conforms to the teller's and the presumed audience's sets of expectations. So the story did immediately get refigured as a number of threats, a number of different different directions. First in allergy forums and sort of the early 2000s or mid 2000s news groups and blogs and so on, and the forums that were emerging then about recognizing the actual perils of allergies. Let's take allergies seriously. And again, like often happens with vernacular health, demonstrating an understanding of how these things work. No, that person still is at risk. The proteins still are in their system. Even after a couple of hours, you can never be too cautious. Whether that's the case or not doesn't really matter, because it can be used as an illustration for the very real point that they are trying to make. Meanwhile, it also becomes a cautionary tale for sexual transgression, or for partying, or for the sort of the arch conservatism, particularly her version of it. But the arch conservatism of, well, had she not been doing this thing, she would be in a safer place. So we sort of see that moment, and it was all having to do with something as innocent as a 15-year-old, 16-year-old girl kissing her boyfriend, and a boyfriend who was aware of allergies to begin with and had applied some caution, but not caution enough. There's a chastity, as it were. I keep on using that word. Perhaps I'm using it inappropriately, but there is, in many ways, this idea of the risk was so minimal, and yet it was still there. And so that element of tragedy. So over to slide 7 now, where we have the women in contamination and contagion narrative section. And Andrea is pointing out what like Gillian Bennett talks about, but again, a theme that we have moved around all semester. And that so many of the things that are the content of contemporary legend are about the sort of small things that are either basic necessities or just above basic necessities, pleasures, comforts, necessities of life. In theory, one could go without them, and therefore, when they are seen as the cause of something, they become pointed out as a risk behavior. Well, if they hadn't done this, they would be safer. They wouldn't have brought this upon themselves. So, and it's particularly the case with women, where you talk about things like, oh, let's go to some of the classics. The spider in the hairdo. It's like, well, she has a fancy haircut, and it requires, a lot of hairspray, and she puts it up, sleeps at night, and doesn't wash it for a long time. It takes a lot of effort. And and as she does so, because she doesn't wash her hair for a long time, a spider's nest gets in there and eats into her brain and kills her. Or spiders come down, she's driven crazy. Or Kentucky Fried Rat, she, instead of cooking for her family, she went to a fast food establishment and got a piece of chicken that turned out to actually be a rodent, and she bit into it and she went crazy. The tanning booth. Oh, she wanted a tan, but through vanity, she wanted to be tanned for her wedding, so she double booked at a whole bunch of different places and cooked her insides. But she didn't need a tan, and she went crazy. Actually, that one she died. So that punishment from the very minor things that are actually sort of basic comforts are just above. It's similar to like the poverty shaming that takes place in terms of, if you only did this thing, you didn't eat your avocado toast, you would have a house by now. That's a good example. The example is only coming to me right now. I was thinking much more in terms of the narratives, like Tom Mold's article on the narratives of welfare cheats. But really, like the sort of the boomer condemnation of millennials are predicated on this idea of you're spending all your money on this thing. Yeah, I mean, we've had that argument. You know what I'm talking about. There's a movie plot about a girl who turns into a zombie because she had sex with a guy who had sex with a corpse. Wow. Look that up. Share it, because I'm interested in that. So I do like this little sentence. Legends about kisses, certainly one of life's pleasures and comforts, remind us that even something as innocent or loving as a kiss can lead to contamination. So, and also, so within that, so just like the basic necessities, human contact, the what the kiss symbolizes in terms of a recognition of some kind of safe relationship, something that is, again, not necessarily sexual but intimate in some level, certainly parent to child, or all those things. Some basic idea of this is something that is a minimal comfort. Even that is a source of fear, a source of contagion. And even though there are the female assassins through their makeup narratives, there's the AIDS Mary narratives, and so on, there are women aggressors, there are women kissers in these narratives. And again, the kisser is always the actor, and the kissed are always the victim. It is more often the woman who is the victim in kiss narratives. So it seems to suggest something. It's called contracted. Thank you, Catherine. There we go. So the sort of strange, slide 8 now, that strange inverse relationship between the intimacy, or the relationship between, the inverse relationship between the level of intimacy between the kisser and the kissed, and the possibility of danger, is a kind of a fascinating aspect of the Kiss of Death legends. As we move from, you are the kiss that is with the person that you feel most comfortable kissing, the one who is not a stranger and is not even this intimate stranger, the one who is the intimate. Those are the ones that most likely result in some kind of death. The sealed with a kiss narratives with pacts with the devil and angels, there's often some way of actually even getting out of them. So it's kind of a fascinating, aspect that over time, the seemingly safe has become the most dangerous. And it demonstrates the sort of shift that's happened over time as we move from speaking about risky persons to risky behaviors. Well, first we move from risky persons to risky behaviors. When we think about, again, sort of AIDS narratives is a good example. It's like, I'm never going to get that because I am not this person. I'm not this category of person. Prostitute, Haitian, and so on, the stigmatized populations. And then when it moves to risk behaviors, it's about 4 degrees better, but still not great, because it's like, I would never get this. I am not at risk because I don't do this thing. And so whether it is, get a lot of blood transfusions or use intravenous drugs or so on, there's still, it's only like one slight remove, or gauge in homosexual sex. It's only one slight remove from the population itself. So it's only a little bit of a shift. But then over time, and you can see that with AIDS, you can see it with other varieties, and you're seeing it now. Over time, the shift is moving so that the risky behaviors are things that in normal circumstances are safe behaviors. It isn't blood transfusions and intravenous drug use. It is just going about your day-to-day routines. It is checking the coin slots in payphones. It is just sitting in a seat in a movie theater. It is going to a club. These activities that heretofore had been safe are now sites of danger. And you can map this out in the whole COVID narratives that we've been going through. This whole experience that you and I have all had, where it's like, I'm not on a cruise ship. I'm fine. I'm not in Wuhan. I'm fine. And then it sort of moves forward to the point where, like, you need to be wiping down every surface in your house every day. The people who I talk to who have sort of anxiety sweats and literally haven't left the house and find the grocery store, the sites of danger, that's what's going to radically transform things. And that is that shift that's happening, that the risk behavior is not being on a cruise ship or eating bat or all these othered activities, these stigmatized activities in stigmatized places among stigmatized people. And yes, people who go on cruise ships have been stigmatized as well. It is now all of us. Everything is now dangerous. And it's a freaky way of living, as I'm sure you're all trying to face the day to day. So when risk behaviors, so I typed this last night, I'm so proud of myself. When risk behaviors are indistinguishable from everyday safe behaviors, checking for coins in the payphone, kissing loved ones, going to Disneyland, going to the goddamn Sobeys, what has happened? Answer, monster is inside the house. We have that shift where we're living in a world where now everything is sort of conceived as a danger. And that's a fairly fascinating thing to live in. Annabelle might be able to look it up while I am here, but or Christine if she's watching. But last semester I was doing this course on festival, and there's this Shiandra, she was in the class as well, and there's this wonderful article about the Fukuyama festival. Fukuyama was that city in Japan that had that triple disaster. There was the tidal wave. Oh, thanks, Annabelle. There was that tidal wave that then sort of went into the nuclear power plant, and it caused a nuclear meltdown. I can't remember what the third part of that was, because all three are pretty nasty. But anyway, it was a worst case scenario. It caused the shutdown of the nuclear power plant, but then also, since it shorted out all the electrical aspects of the vicinity, that plant went into some kind of meltdown. Fukushima. Was it Fukushima? Fukushima, thank you. Again, this is all by memory. And Annabelle has the article ahead. But there's this wonderful theme in there, which I think is something that, of all the things taken from the festival course and all the things that I could be bringing in to future work, it's this idea that in Japan there are these two meanings of the word safe, or rather there are two terms for safe. And one is sort of, as it were, quantitative. It has to do with sort of the objective reality of what are safe levels. So it's like there are meters in the town, because they hold a festival here, and the festival is kind of ironic in terms of trying to bring people into this place that is also framed as unsafe. And so they have these meters, like there's only a certain amount of rads in the atmosphere right now that is in safe levels. And so it meets the objective criteria, it meets the scientific criteria of what constitutes safe. And yet there's that second meaning of that sense of safety, that feeling it's almost like safe more in terms of comfort than whether one is in or not in a statistical range of danger. Hi, Andrea. Annabelle sent me a link. Have you sent that link? Or you're just about to paste it in? Anyway, it's this wonderful article. I'll find the link to it. And it's one of the things I should probably have mentioned to Andrea for her work as well, going forward, but I only came across it a couple of months ago. This dual sense of safety. And I think that is that those are terms that could be picked up, because I think it really straddles that distinction between institutional understandings of what constitutes risk and not risk, and then the vernacular understandings, or really not even vernacular. It's more about affectivity. It's more about that sense, that interpretation that is based as much on emotion as it is on parsing the data. And that, if you are insensitive to the idea that a place does not feel safe, doesn't matter how many meters and stuff that you have up there. There's an episode of Dark Tours that deals the relative safety in those areas of Japan. Yeah. So anyway, I sort of went on a bit of a trail, but I think that's it. What happens again when the kisses are the monsters that are inside the house? Let me move on to the next slide. So conclusion. I'm on slide 9. So the concluding chapter is, in some ways, it's a summary, and you can read that for a summary, and it's good because it sort of nicely synthesizes much of her point. Hey, I know you have read the book diligently, but when you're preparing for your exam, you could perhaps using the slides, and if you needed to refresh, the main arguments are probably in the conclusion. But so skipping that part, there's a thing about the health policy. And so the points that leap out, one of them is that health policy is driven as much by belief and ideology as it is by science. It should be driven by science. Science informs, but again, as we are seeing in this very instance, science can only inform. Science can't necessarily set the policy. It could suggest the parameters, but then policy becomes employed by people who believe. So what happens if you have anti-science? What happens if you have cultural bias in terms of racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, all these sorts of things? We have the same argument in terms of the whether the aged should be getting treatments for coronavirus because they are most at risk. And so is that basically sort of throwing good money after bad? And the fact that that's a legitimate argument, I'm not saying it's a legitimate argument, but it's a genuine argument that is being waged as we speak, seems to suggest something about the clash between between the objective scientific data and how that objective scientific data is interpreted, let alone the idea of whether that data is truly objective, or many ideologues just imagine that all understanding is ideologically driven. And so anything that doesn't fall into his purview just becomes as easily dismissed as just your dumb cousin's opinion. There we go. There's a direct correlation. A secondary point. There's a direct correlation between disease conceived of as a consequence of taboo violation. That disease is the inherent, or rather, the diseased, being ill, is a direct consequence of having violated some kind of transgression, some kind of taboo. And again, that sort of moral hazard argument creeps in around the sides. But the fact that there is that correlation it indicates something along the lines of, because disease is thought of in that way, it provides further obstacles for how to establish health policy. And then that's sort of doubly exacerbated when those taboo violations are bound by, again, sexism, ableism, homophobia, and so on. So how do I phrase it? Yeah, it's clearly it's doubled. And so it's an obstacle for policy. It's an obstacle for healthcare. We don't need to ward against this because the people who do this have invited it upon themselves. And so it becomes an obstacle for women's health in particular, because the taboo violators are so often women, or anyone who is not a able-bodied white male. And so, and I think the third overall point that Andrea makes is, while science's arrogance is a problem in communicating its own message — we talked about science and arrogance before — distrust in the science is arguably far worse. Both sides need to come to their senses and come to the table. But we as folklorists can hold people in some kind of rapt wonder in terms of marvel at their creativity and their performance strategies and how they can create narrative. And on one hand, we can sort of put a pin in that and go, look at that, isn't that kind of remarkable? But that doesn't mean that we need to support its existence. We need to take its causes seriously, recognize that this is coming from some effort at articulating something, but we don't have to sit down and just simply accept it as the folks' delightful creations, because that's real world consequences. So the B-mean for this final chapter is, not all traditions are worth studying or maintaining. And I believe by that she means, certainly, although anti-vaccination narratives are worth studying, they're definitely not worth maintaining. They should definitely be silenced, as should, of course, most racist narratives, like Neil Rosenberg's study of the folklore of whites against African Americans in the American South. It should be studied. There's no reason for it to continue. That's why he puts moratoria on who can actually read his research. Not all social norms are in the best interest of all members of a folk group. And finally, not all voices are the voice of all members of the folk group. God, there you go. Run away with that and feed your soul. So Andrea is a good way of ending the semester. I'm moving on to slide 10. Oh, hold on a second. Kima, I saw a veganism post stating that going vegan will prevent the next disease outbreak. And then Andrea said, yep, that's what I mean. I'm not 100% sure. Oh, that's what I mean in terms of studying versus maintaining. I'm just presuming yes. Okay. So when I do urban legend, I try, every time I teach the course, I try and sort of lay the groundwork, and then I assign basically the most recent text for as like okay, well, let's look at an actual monograph of contemporary legend or a collection. So like last time it was the Slender Man special issue of contemporary legend. This year it was Andrea's book, and who knew how timely Andrea's book would be, because that's just weird. But still, as we sort of take just this final step back and start trying to retrace the semester, because as I said last video, this is, you didn't learn 20 individuated things. You hopefully learned one thing that was a cumulative argument going through the point. Hi, Kim. One cumulative argument about the role that our narrative impulse plays. The contemporary legend is a way of trying to make sense in moments of uncertainty, to double down on belief systems when need be, to negotiate those belief systems at the same time. They are about their efforts at understanding. They are the creating of phantasms that can then be subject to some kind of verification or not. Yeah, that's a point I raised about 8 weeks ago, and I hope someone did write it down so I can frame that into Lonergan's noetic phenomenology in terms of the insight into phantasm. The first thing you need to do is phantasm. And so one of the things that one does is one takes the data of the senses and it diagrams it. The idea of a legend as a diagram about this is the model for what is actually happening, and then there's the subsequent verification about whether that diagram actually makes sense, or whether it is required. I'm digressing because I got a lot to cover, but anyway, there we go. Man is the meaning-making animal, says Kim. Yes, there we go. But I know that man is in quotes because men don't mean much, do they? Why am I should be looking at the camera instead I'm just staring at a PowerPoint. That's very boring, and now I know how all of you feel. So, since the start of the semester, we've been framing legend in response to belief positions. And the first thing we did is we talked about Hufford, and we wanted you to knock you out of your sense of complacency about belief and disbelief. And so we read his Traditions of Disbelief article, and that notion that all systems of knowing, for the most part, are cumulative things that one has taken uncritically. Some are more valid than others, but they're both efforts. They're both more received than they are necessarily immediately experienced. And the privilege of certain forms of knowing that immediately dismiss other forms of knowing are problematic. And it isn't a way of necessarily telling you that you need to believe in witches and ghosties and Draculas, from the get-go. But what you do need to at least begin with is the notion that when people are using the language of belief, they are not inherently foolish or naive. They are more often than not trying to articulate an experience and using the language, the fluency, the competency of their world in order to make sense of it. And that's a key aspect of this narrative making exercise that we're engaged in. We moved on to Daniel Barnes and said you want to remember that these are also texts as much as they are the interplay between language, between experience and seeking a language for that experience in order to communicate and subsequently make sense of that experience. The fact that we frame them and reframe them as we go into the act of retelling them. They're also performances, they are linguistic creations, and we should be paying attention to how they are formed, because how they are formed might actually give an indication of what we are trying to do, because we are using the unconscious narrative fluency that we have about, we understand what story is. And so let's look at story. Let's look at how we are immediately able to frame experience, or over time, this is the best way of expressing this experience. Let's look at this as a narrative structure. Let's actually sort of tear it apart and have some fun with it. Ellis sort of takes that idea and plays with it a little bit further and asks us to think about when the thing is actually being told. If we're thinking of legends as these relatings of experiences, when is it just simply the beginnings of being able to take the data of the senses and memory and frame this thing as associated with this inherited term for this thing? Like, oh, this is one of them Dracula moments. And then the initial ugly, most, not necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing, but the sort of the initial effort of translating the experience into words and turning it into the beginnings of a narrative, however clunky that narrative might be, and then subsequently the reshaping of that narrative when we realize that there's not only is it the urgent communication of me trying to tell you what my experience is, but also the the recognition that I am engaged in narrative, the reflective aspect of, oh, this is also a good story and how the story can be shaped. So long after the need for the experience to be related might have disappeared, the story becomes the story. And it's like, oh, well, this is now an object within a repertoire, and a lived object within a repertoire. And then after a while, it sort of fades out of need because stories eventually exhaust themselves, but it can always be brought back. But it might just exist in the world of, I'm getting a Quark update. Camera's still on. That's good. It still exists in the shared repertoire metonymically. And then finally, what we might see, or what often we only get to see, what we see in Snopes, what we see in classic collections of legend, is the legend report, abstracted from the negotiation, abstracted from the aesthetics of performance, and really just the plot details. And then that's when you get like, these people believe that this thing happened. And you're like, well, then them people's is dumb, because you're not necessarily getting the whole process either of the pushback of the reality that happens in that negotiated process of legend, or the idea that, oh, this is a framed aesthetic event. This isn't a belief, capital B, creedal dogma. This is something that exists within the repertoire. Buy-in to that belief is not necessarily present, but nevertheless, it is something that at the moment of performance can be enacted, and everyone's like, yeah, Draculas. Yeah, tell me about your Draculas. Buchan also talks about something similar, where he talks about, first of all, the repetition of themes over time, where we don't necessarily have a genetic relationship, a true sort of a genealogy of a particular narrative strain. Nevertheless, we can see the same narrative diachronically, and how it emerges over time, but how it's conceived of differently, where it might be anecdote or fanciful thing, or it might be again back to that urgent communication. So we have that switch back and forth, again using the traditum idea, where it's a belief that may or may not be active but is known, and it can move from being just something that no one actually believes but everyone knows to, oh, this is actually active and real and true. And so it is so as we are framing legends as issues of belief, sometimes legends are not believed, and sometimes the exact same text in a different context is believed. And so we can't simply use a legend as a belief, legend blah, 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 as our narrative basis for them, or as a descriptor of them. And then we turn to Diane's article, where she sort of shows off, very well. Never mind. Different thing. Where she's demonstrating how, again, if you're just looking at legend reports and it's like, these people believe this thing, you're like, well, what's with that? But if you listen to people who are actually telling their legends most of the time, unless they are in a much more performative frame, and they are sort of heightened sense where they are, right there. It's like, oh, what's happening? When they're really sort of recounting it in their sort of first flush, they will often go into things that we might think of as tangential, but really they are grounding their experience in the reality that they know. So they will go into long descriptions of things that seem to fall outside of the actual narrative flow, when really their efforts at grounding the narrative, it's like, I know these things to be the case, and this is the anomaly. So people, even if they admit or accept the idea that their particular belief experience can only be understood through this supernatural frame, it's something that typically they approach reluctantly, because they are trying to understand their experience much more empirically than immediately leaping forward to the supernatural, as a tradition of disbelief might otherwise suggest. It's like, oh, you just believe in ghosts. It's like, I really don't, but I don't have a better explanation for it, and I'm a rational person. I got to take a sip of my liquids, because then we move away from the supernatural and we start shifting towards beliefs that are not about the transcendent necessarily, but much more about the immanent, sociocultural beliefs. Gender, race, sex, violence, fresh fruit. So we talked about Patricia Turner's article, and sort of the the notion of the theme of the threat against the African American male body as being prominent in African American folklore, to the point where there are narratives that an outsider wouldn't necessarily even begin to remotely accept. Things like the church's chicken. It's like, that can't be. But within the real lived history that contextualizes this narrative theme as often verifiably enacted. The history of the Pale Riders, the history of lynching, the history of the deliberate floods of New Orleans, the history of the Tuskegee Airmen, and so on. The idea that fundamentally all resources are being directed towards the destruction of the black male body, even in sort of a seemingly preposterous context, it's like, yeah, well, that's the kind of thing that can happen. So I'm not, at the very least, I'm open to it as a possibility. So, and then further on, a parallel, another legacy of colonialism and sort of the in addition to or over and above slavery, it's sort of the British colonialism and the attitudes towards Africa when we're talking about the origins of, or the explanatory devices for the spread of AIDS in Africa, where it's rooted in this, Orientalist isn't quite the right word for it, but it's rooted in this colonial attitude towards the fundamental uncivilized practices of a continent that we choose not to distinguish in any way from itself. And so, but how that actually creeps into the scientific literature. And again, it creeps into the scientific literature to such a point that it affects policy, and that we should be directing our resources towards people not to engage in scarification. It's like, no, it should be condoms in cities. People are not living this 18th century life described by missionaries who were basically trying to conjure up a couple of shekels in order to continue their mission by having these horrific tales sent back to the United Kingdom. These are modern people, and their risk behaviors are the same as the North American ones. But it's a difficult lens to see through. Colonialism fogs all glasses. And then you have Whatley and Henkin, where they're talking about the or they're talking about sort of the taboo violations of the other, either the sexualized female or the sexualized homosexual, and they're both fundamentally in their acts are the narratives, the male heterosexual narratives about either female sexuality or male homosexuality, objects of narratives of strange fascination, which allow them to discuss in great detail those facets, and yet still imagine oneself removed from them. And in part, the way that the narratives always end in some kind of punishment, of harm, of debasement, of shame, of intrusion, violation of some description, are part of the it's part of the complex, and that it reinforces that this behavior is fundamentally aberrant. So again, it reaches down to that conservatism. And then Joel Kahn's article about the Pocahontas McGinty, and the idea of how this actually, on the surface, this seemingly banal narrative about naming conventions among the Scottish working class, it becomes this extension of class stratification, and the idea that, we can, these are people who are allowed to vote, and yet lo and behold, this is the foolish thing, the danger that they are putting their children in by giving them an embarrassing name. And then we had a midterm, and then we had snowstorms, and we had a whole bunch of things. And then we moved on to our discussion of legend quests and legend trips with Melly, who sort of introduced us to them and talked about how this certain fascination with certain uncanny parts of the countryside around Columbia, Pennsylvania, were part and parcel of a town, of adolescent life in a town that is undergoing a certain sense of decline. and the uncertainty that futures might face, and the beginnings of intimations of mortality. And then Bird talks about the dark angel, the black angel in Iowa City, and in part because it is that anomalous figure, as opposed to Haug's Road and the cemetery in in Pennsylvania. In Iowa City, it's this black angel, already this anomalous artistic creation. Those narratives tend to be a lot more about sex and death and transgression and infidelity, and so they are more gendered exercises and continue. And because it's also associated with the university, that continues into a population that is beyond the sort of classically adolescent of the 14 to 17, but it becomes part of the university lore as well. And that leads us into Libby Tucker's article on legend quests and the idea that they have her term of art, because they tend to imply something a bit more meaningful. But she frames them particularly within the university experience itself, trying to make sense of being a member of the community, trying to make sense of some of the legacies, because she was really interested in some of the ones that Joe Goodwin had pointed out in Alabama, and the outside of Tuscaloosa, and the legacy of the South and the legacy of plantation culture. Just at the time, people are going through the university experience away from home, more away from home than the adolescent teenager who is temporarily away from home. But trying to make sense of both this new stricture, but also the atmosphere of the academy, where these questions start to emerge and start to be articulated in different ways, and the sense of social justice that might have been nascent in an adolescence, but is now hopefully burgeoning to some extent, or not hopefully, but more likely to be burgeoning at this sort of critical juncture. And then Lindahl points out that it's not simply adolescence, that legend trips can also have sort of a quasi-religious practice, where they aren't framed merely as play, or reframed merely as play subsequent to the fact, but truly understood as potentially transformative acts that are contiguous with forms of religious obligation. So again, a whole bunch of particularly interesting things are going on. I just need to sort of play with some windows. How am I doing for time? Oh my goodness. Is that at 72 minutes? Egads, I got to edit this thing later on. But I said it was going to be long. I know we only have technically a few more minutes, but bear with me because I think I'm almost on the last slide. Boom. Yes, I am. So then we end with Andrea. We end with Kitta. And then, so again, framing this along the lines of belief, she's talking about both literal but metaphorical contagion and the blurred line in between, a hybrid between the literal and the metaphorical. Look at us using terms, aren't we clever? And by doing so, she's able to demonstrate the role that belief plays in the very world that we live in, the belief of transgression, the belief of how notions of contact, the remnants of contagious magic, and then often filtered through a language of science, because vernacular understanding is often often a hybrid of scientific explanation and fundamentally almost magical practices. I don't think Andrew would necessarily frame it that way, but she can hop on and tell me differently. But she positions folklorists as fundamentally and uniquely suited for being the voices in this particular conundrum of how do you negotiate between the institutional and the vernacular when there are real world consequences, when there are policy consequences, when there are health consequences. And that it is not simply a matter of the informed folklorist being able to do this. It is the notion that the informed folklorist fundamentally has an obligation to do this. So it's the bit where she moves towards or she moves towards advocacy. Oh, what part are you, Andrea? What part are you commenting on? Oh, I can't remember now. You're going to have to scoot back, but we'll talk later. Yes. Oh no. Something I said something along the lines of um, that what we sort of have a lot of the sort of vernacular understanding is this sort of monstrous hybrid, yet again, between scientific between an understanding of scientific practice, but also a sort of almost religio magico practices, and that the two are hard to disentangle from each other within the vernacular discourse. Again, I don't know if we necessarily would say that, but it's a comment to think about. But I am like 2 minutes away from my grand finale. So here. So again, she's not simply saying that we can do this. She is saying that we ought to be doing this, that she's turning folklore, as she should be, into there's an advocacy that is present. Otherwise, it is just very fun navel gazing. And so my last sentence for y'all: when your respective parents ask why you took a folklore course, it is basically about saving the world. Look at me. Yeah, I bet all you little bastards thought it would just be a bunch of stuff about Slender Man and alligators and sewers. And lo and behold, I now am sending you off on a mission. If you never take another folklore course again, I hope you have learned something. So yeah, that's it, really. Of course, I would have wanted this semester to have gone differently. I would have wanted to be able to see you all, look you all in the eye, and at least, at the very least, in a perfect world, bid you a fond farewell and a hail and hearty handshake and high fives and all the like. I hope you are well in what you are doing. I hope you are either graduating and going off into the world, or you are coming back in September, and I hope there is a place to come back to in September. I have no problem with teaching online, but I think that there's something about being in a room together. The entire university experience is some way ought to be just being in a room where you don't need to think about the outside world, and you just engage in thought play for 4 years. And that's incredibly privileged attitude to have, but at least it moves it away from thinking of university as purely instrumental. But we're not having that. We're not having that now. I hope we have it again in the future. And I do hope you are all well. I hope people that I see regularly, what the few folkies that we have, I hope that you are hail for this summer, and I see you again in September. For those who just took this because it fit their schedule and it seemed fun, I do hope that you got something out of it. As Warren Zevon said, keep me in your hearts a little while. So get the assignments in. I'll be marking them. Study for the exam. There'll be a cheat sheet up soon. And for God's sakes, wash your hands. I love you all. Bye-bye. You stay safe too, John James.